It's a youth movement in politics this country hasn't seen, arguably, since the Vietnam era. School shootings and mass shootings have sparked activism around the issue of gun control, and at least for the moment, the voices of teens and 20-somethings are driving the debate. So today, some younger voices of our own here in New Hampshire have joined us for what could be a lively discussion. Joe Sweeney of the New Hampshire Young Republicans and Lucas Meyer of New Hampshire Young Democrats. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
So let's start with you, Lucas. As a voting bloc, younger voters have been notoriously unreliable. As motivated as they might seem, it's always harder to get them to turn out when November comes around. Is that going to be different in 2018?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, since the election, you've seen such an increase in interest in the political process here in New Hampshire. And certainly what we saw last weekend across the state with marches in Keene and Portsmouth and Concord is certainly at the high school level a whole new interest in the political process and sort of an expression of sort of young people being sick of the status quo, certainly as it pertains to gun violence in this country. Folks are sick and tired of seeing the same policies get rejected, that we can't get any sort of common sense gun prevention legislation passed, not only in the state but in this country. And they're ready to speak out. They're ready to take action. And I think this is a movement that has some longevity to it. I mean, you saw in the 80s with Ronald Reagan, a large block of young conservatives get really invested in his campaign, and now you're seeing that leadership continue, folks in their 50s, 60s now running the Republican Party. And I think it's going to be important as we develop this movement. And these young people are not Republicans, they're not Democrats. These are just high school students who are reacting to a really visceral issue that they relate to and they see in their communities, and they're scared and they want to see some change. And so certainly what the Young Democrats are focused on is making sure those young people have a voice, whether that's in the State House, whether that's speaking on legislation, providing them resources, tools, but also having young people run for office. You know, these activists, these people who are getting involved in the movement, they're going to want to see younger people elected to office. That's why the Young Democrats have our 603 Forward program, where we train, recruit, and elect young Democrats. Last city election cycle, we had over 35 candidates run, had 15 elected, and we want to keep doing that, certainly to 2018, where we have over 30 young Democrats already pledged to run for the House. So really making sure that we can continue this movement meaningfully into the future is important.
Joe, what do you think as you see, especially around these marches, young people moving in a direction that, you know, obviously there are conservative voices here right now, but we're seeing a lot of activism around looking at the right to bear arms, and even a former Supreme Court justice, very old, saying it's time to repeal the Second Amendment. What do you think as you see the youth movement get behind something like that?
Absolutely, and I think there's definitely action behind the youth movement. It's organizing throughout the country and throughout the state, but I don't necessarily think there are specific ideologies that they're based around. And I think there was a lot of marches this past weekend, and I thought that was great. But I don't know if there was a specific thread that tied really what everybody in the marches wanted. We have there's a Democratic gubernatorial candidate for the last 2 months has been pushing gun control measures, and he's only polling at 11% in the Democratic primary right now. He's not really well known, and people on the left have a lot of ideas. There's a lot of visions out there, but they're not unified. They don't know exactly what they're going for. So I don't think there's a common thread. I don't think they know that gun control, and if they want to have the debate about repealing the Second Amendment, I think that's the debate that Republicans would like to have with Democrats.
What do you think, Lucas?
I think that's a disservice to the message that these young people are pushing out there. I don't think anyone's suggesting that. And I think there are common threads that tie this debate together, where we're looking, you know, you just had Republican governors in Vermont, in Florida, who are looking at raising the age to buy a gun, expanding our background checks, banning bump stocks, looking more holistically at this issue and just trying to get something done. I mean, we saw last session the first bill passed and signed into law in New Hampshire was banning concealed carry. So now we had an amendment last week from Senator Hennessy in the Senate to provide some clarity to school districts as to whether they could ban guns in their schools. And right now there isn't that clarification. So there is a thread being tied here, and there are young people who do have a very coherent message as to what they want to see. And if they don't see those changes made, they're going to vote, and they're going to organize, and they're going to find politicians who will support those very reasonable common sense gun prevention legislation.
Well, I would respond to that by saying that our gun laws are pretty reasonable in New Hampshire already. We have a very safe state, one of the safest states in the country, year after year. And we don't see those issues in New Hampshire. And I think constitutional carry, when Governor Sununu signed that, has made our state safer. And I disagree with the notion that it's actually put us at risk. And I just see a lot of
just jump in
conjecture.
real quick here. Joe, in your opinion, what do old people in politics right now not get about the younger generation at the moment?
It's a good question. Let me think about that for a second. I think mainly it's just how we organize and how we mobilize. It's not traditional based politics anymore. We organize on social media. We organize through different action movements that are going on. It's not considerable. You're not going to find a lot of young people that are going to be, I want to be a Republican, I want to be a Democrat. They're just concerned about the issues in general, and that's what they're fighting for. And so I think Lucas had mentioned this earlier, there's not a ton of necessarily partisanship among this youth movement that's going forward. They'll agree with Republicans someday and they'll agree with Democrats another day. I think there are a lot of young people who support Governor Sununu. He's the youngest governor in the nation. And I think that is, when it comes down to what old people might not understand about the youth, is just how we operate as a bloc.
What do you think about that, Lucas?
So I think, certainly the demographic shift from young people from the Republican Party and the Democratic Party has been very pronounced in the past couple of years. I think over 70% of millennial women identify with the Democratic Party. I think you've seen around 25% of young Republicans switch to the Democratic Party. And what's been very encouraging within the Democratic Party is there's been a focus to welcome those voices of leadership. We've been fortunate enough as an organization to have a lot of support in the state. We've already raised $50,000 this year, which is already double what we raised in 2017. A lot of grassroots money, a lot of grassroots support, because folks understand in the Democratic Party that we need to build a bench of young leaders in the state who are going to speak the language of folks like Joe and I, so we can lower tuition in New Hampshire. We have the highest college tuitions in the country. We provide under $93 per capita to the student in New Hampshire. Compare that to Wyoming, where it's $448. We have a problem attracting and retaining young people. Joe and I grew up in the state. Not a lot of kids I went to high school with stayed in the state. 60% of four-year seeking high school graduates leave the state. What are we doing to fix that? Certainly the past budget forced the tuitions to increase at our university system. The governor created the Millennial Advisory Council, which is a great first step. There have been a lot of recommendations made by that Millennial Advisory Council that have not been listened to. So we're hopefully looking forward to some changes in that regard. But at least within the Democratic Party, we've had this really a wide embrace of these young voices, to elevate them, to take them seriously, and that's been very encouraging.
Joe, you have a response?
I would just say I disagree that the Millennial Advisory Council is not being listened to. There was a roundtable Thursday night in Manchester with the Millennial Advisory Council, with the governor at the head of the table. So the governor is listening, and he's the one that created that Millennial Advisory Council. You didn't see that from Governor Lynch, you didn't see that from Governor Hassan. Governor Sununu got that done.
Well, I'm sure he's listening. We look forward to some policy actions as a result of that. We saw in the last budget $0 allocated for workforce development. We'd love to see that change. I know the governor has been on both sides of rail a couple times now, and I think now we're back on supporting passenger rail, which is great. We're here in Manchester. We have some incredible developments happening in the Mill Yard that are attracting a lot of young people to the state, a lot of highly educated, skilled workers to the state, and we should be doing whatever we can to get more of those kids into the state and keep them here, and also keep the talent that we have graduating from our great public schools.
As we wrap up here, let's take a look before I know you guys are both dedicated to your own parties here, but let's try and open up the self-introspection. Lucas, what can your party do better to keep and retain young people in it?
What can we do better? I think it's just continuing to find young leaders and make sure we give them the resources they need, because running for elected office in New Hampshire is tough. Joe served. You know how tough it is. You only get $100. You have to have a schedule that allows it. So I think I'd actually like to see in the Democratic Party some more reforms for the House. What can we do to either make it more sensible for young people to serve? Right now we have session, middle of the day, long hours. In Rhode Island, they have session in the later half of the day. Could we go to maybe one session every 2 years, maybe 90 days? So I think finding ways that we can incorporate those younger voices, because there is an absence in the State House of younger voices.
Joe, what do you think? What can Republicans do better for young people?
Yeah, I think Republicans do a lot of good for young people in the state of New Hampshire. But I just think always listening more, and along the same lines, just encouraging young Republicans to step up and lead. We do have a lot of young Republicans in office, and I just think moving that forward and keep progressing that.
All right. Well, gentlemen, it was good to have you here, and we want to say we had you here first for the governor's race in 2048. It'll be Meyer versus Sweeney. All right.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, we appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, Adam.